Welcome back, everybody, coast to coast. This week in America, Army Letters, the new book, Army Letters, Correspondence of Alexander Smoot, 1932 to 1935, is the story of an American family during one of the harshest times in history. The author is Geoffrey Smoot, Alexander's oldest son. He's a retired history teacher. He has a BS from Penn State, a master's from Salisbury University. Spent 4 years in the U.S. Coast Guard before attending college, was a longtime high school baseball coach, a member of the Coaches Baseball Hall of Fame. He's active in his church and community. Geoffrey Smoot, author of Army Letters, Correspondence of Alexander Smoot, 1932 to 1935, is our guest on today's This Week in America. Geoffrey, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us.
Rick, this is really a pleasure for me. I enjoyed it because if I enjoy this as much as I enjoyed, transferring his letters to the printed media, I'll be very delighted after this interview's over.
Well, I tell you, you really are touching a lot of people who are reading your father's words and really putting into focus what life was like during this period. And let's go back and talk about that. Your dad was a high school graduate in 1931. Talk about what life was like back then. To most people, 1931 is just a year. That was sort of what sandwiched in between the Depression and the early stages of World War II. What was life like back then?
Well, it was really tough, and of course, when he graduated high school, back then they only had 11 grades, and he graduated high school. His older brother had played minor league baseball for a while, but he had gotten out of that and he kept back and forth between the minor leagues working because back then money was not the big thing for anybody who played minor league baseball. But Dad had spent time trying to find a job here in the Salisbury area. But, of course, during the Depression, that was in the really depth of the Depression before even Roosevelt had been elected. And he finally decided, as his mother, my grandmother, had done, she moved to Reading, Pennsylvania from Salisbury to be with her by aunt, his older sister, who was a school teacher. She graduated from what was then Salisbury Normal School, which now is Salisbury University. But she moved to Reading, and my grandmother, because she just couldn't make ends meet. My grandfather had died of meningitis when he was 52 years old. And she was on her own and pretty much supported the family on her own. So she went to Reading, and Dad, of course, tried to get a job after high school here and could not do it. And he followed her to, first of all, he went to his brother's in up near Baltimore in a place called Glen Burnie. But then he went to Reading, and he tried to catch a job there. But that didn't happen. So what was left? The only thing left was to maybe go in the Army. And he had dreams of going to West Point, and he kept, that dream alive when he joined the service, because that was one of the reasons he joined the service. He was hoping to be able to go to West Point. But he joined the service. He thought maybe he could help his family by sending money home, and he, of course, aspired to go to West Point.
It's interesting because of this really close relationship with his mother. And in the book, he talks about in his letters his really the love for his mother and his sense of what obligation he really was trying to help her out financially, because things obviously were tough for her and the rest of the family.
Oh, that's true. And, my grandmother, when she lived in Reading, actually took in boarders, and she would have people that lived with them, and they would pay a small amount of rent, and she would, cook, and they'd have a bed for them and whatever. And it was very, very tough to make ends meet. And, of course, my aunt was teaching, and as you might suspect, the salaries for teachers back then was very, very small, and she was not able to provide enough. So Dad thought that, well, if he went in the Army, he could provide at least some kind of an allowance that he could send home. But as you delve into the book, you'll find out that didn't happen. And there are a lot of reasons that are in the book that he talks about that he couldn't send very much money home. But if you get into the book and you read, he valued even nickels. I mean, when he talked about a nickel, today a nickel, people don't even think about change anymore. And a nickel, a dime, a quarter. I mean, that was big money for these people, and you can imagine how tough the times were.
Well, in the book, and we're talking about the book Army Letters, Correspondence of Alexander Smoot, 1932 to 1935. Yeah, he's talking about one of the letters back is like payday rolling around as usual, nothing left after paying the bills. And he really thought he thought he was going
Sometimes, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Rick. Sometimes he would complain because then not only did he have enough to pay the bills, he would have to. I love the term that he used. I hadn't heard it used that way before, but he talked about buying things jawbone. And jawboning was meaning that you ran credit with somebody, whether it was the Chinese tailor who was doing his uniforms, or whether it was the laundry or whatever. He would have to owe somebody, and he would borrow money from guys. And if he had a few extra bucks on a payday, they'd borrow from him. It must have been really a tough situation for these guys, because I think at one time his monthly salary was $19 a month.
Which is just amazing. And when he went in, he thought he was going to be able to maybe send a little bit back home to take care of people, and he barely had enough that he could take care of himself.
Well, that's correct. And, the thing that really impacted him, as you get in the book, you'll read this too, the Depression was so harsh that a lot of those guys that had served in World War I and had gotten out and were working, and then they lost their jobs, they came back in the service. Well, when they came back in, they recouped their old ratings. So here he was. When he went in, he was a private, and when he got out, he was a PFC, private first class. That's all he could get because of the backlog of these old timers that would come in, and they were the corporals and whatever. So he never could make a rate, and he actually was very proud. And when he died, before he died, he asked me to make sure that on his tombstone that we made sure that it was PFC. Alexander Smoot, because he was so proud of the fact that he was a private first class. He just never could make rate because there wasn't any rate to be made.
The book is really a great history lesson. It tells us a lot about that era and what people had to go through. And your dad gets in, and he's thinking he's going to go up the ranks, and maybe this is going to be something that's got some long-lasting possibilities. And what basically the promotion ladder was clogged. Like you said, everybody was coming back, and there were too many people and not enough positions.
That's exactly right. And he talked about the fact that he might even he was thinking that towards the end of his service, he was thinking about shipping over, re-enlisting actually, and possibly going to China, the Philippines, or something like that. He didn't do that, of course, but they had promised him if he would ship over that he would get promoted to corporal. But that was something that he had gotten to the point where he was very cynical about promotions, and I think he finally decided that wasn't the route to go. But it was very tough, and he was tough on himself because he couldn't do as much as he'd like to for his family, and he had hoped that because he would get promoted, he would have more money, but it didn't happen. It didn't work out that way.
You're listening to This Week in America. Our website is thisweekinamerica.us. Our guest on the program is Geoffrey Smoot. We're talking about the book he's written, Army Letters, Correspondence of Alexander Smoot, 1932 to 1935, actual letters from his father. When did you realize you're sitting on something that's really a fascinating human interest story and really an excellent piece of history from that era as well? When did you realize I really need to do something with this?
Well, there's really two things here, Rick. Number one, I like to preserve the legacy of my father, and he was grandfather to my children, whatever, and then my brother's children, and I'd like to preserve that. But as a former history teacher, I taught advanced placement U.S. history, and even when I was getting my master's degree and going, and even as far back as when I was in Penn State getting my bachelor's degree, we often had to read these what we called primary source material. Now, the book itself, it's a collection of letters, and it's anecdotal history of an American family during the Great Depression. But in that, there's really about three themes. One is the soldier's life, which we've been talking about off and on, his family during the Depression and how to help them if he possibly could. And then, of course, he wrote quite often about back home in Salisbury, what was going on back there, because once in a while, somebody would be moved or stationed into his unit or in the area that he knew, and they would share letters or share old newspapers and things like that. Because actually, like we talked earlier about newspapers were a big thing back then, and so there's those three themes that are overriding in the whole book.
As you read the book Army Letters, I really get a sense of who your dad is, a sense of that time. As you went back and really analyzed and did the transcribing and putting this together, did this give you a different understanding? Do you know your dad better now after the project than you did before the book?
Rick, you hit it right on the head. There's many times in his older days he would come over to our house, and there was a situation where my hometown I grew up in, Sharptown, Maryland, was having a real problem with their water. Didn't taste well and all that. And Dad would come over to our house, which is about 12 miles from where I grew up, and our well here was it's great water, very good tasting. And he'd bring these gallon jugs over, and when he always came over, he would sit on the back porch with me, and he'd have a glass of ice water, and we'd sit there. And, I would listen to him talk about his youth and things like that, but I never really fully comprehended what he was like when he was a 19, 20, 21-year-old until I got into these letters. And there were points in the letters that almost made me cry sometimes because I saw in them things that later on made him what he became. And he was highly respected. He was a coach of baseball, too, highly respected. And I just learned so much about him through these letters. And I learned about, I guess, family and his love of his family, love of he loved life. There's no question about it. And the other thing that I really really appreciated about it, and I guess as a teacher this comes out in me, there was even a point in there one time where he actually checked out a book in their library, the Gaelic Wars, Caesar's Gaelic Wars, where he got it in Latin so he could read it in Latin. Well, I can't imagine that to me was a Herculean task.
Boy, that's for sure.
But, that's what he did, and it also showed too how well he was educated in the local schools that when he graduated. He as you read the letters, I'm impressed also with how grammatically correct they are. Now there's some spellings, but the spellings, a lot of them are colloquialisms, and he spelled it the way they spell it around here.
Did an excellent job of really explaining very graphically what life was like, what his thoughts were during this period. The book is Army Letters, Correspondence of Alexander Smoot, 1932-1935, the story of an American family during one of the harshest times in history, written by his son, Geoffrey Smoot. The book's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Information you can link on directly at our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and get information on the book. Let's talk a little bit about when your dad came back, and it's interesting as he's getting closer to the honorable discharge. And interesting because he thought for a while college really, he was kidding himself to think he was going to go to college. He gets back, he does go to college, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. And the last part of the book, he talks about there was a soldier that ended up going to University of Alabama, and he was thinking about that. Of course, I'm still shocked today about the prices they were talking about. You could get a semester of education for like $200 or $100. Of course, today you can't even get a week's worth of education.
Exactly.
Kind of money. But he ended up going to Albright College, which is in Reading, Pennsylvania. That's, of course, it made sense because that's where he went back to his mother, my grandmother, and he lived, there until he moved into the college dorms. And of course, he was a pretty good athlete, a good baseball player, and he played baseball and football at Albright just like he had done in the service in his 19th Infantry, regiment. I always liked that regiment because that was the Rock of Chickamauga, it was called, the Hawaiian Regiment, which no longer is in existence. So I think I believe it's the 24th Infantry today, but I might stand corrected on that.
Yeah, he was in Hawaii during this period. Talk about his role over there, what they were attempting to do, and how things worked out in a different direction.
Oh yeah, well, it's almost today. It's ironic when you think about it. He talks about, of course, their training, and you see a lot of that in there. He mentions how he was trained. He was an infantry soldier, but he always talked about he had kind of a yearning to become a machine gunner or possibly moving into some kind of another area of the Army. He never did that. He always ended up, he stayed as an infantryman, mainly because he was such a good athlete that the lieutenant in his company made sure that he stayed in there so he could play baseball. And of course, the football coach and another lieutenant wanted him around because he played football too. So his time in Hawaii, he talks about the when he went out on training maneuvers and things like that. One of the times it went up around the volcanoes, and he talks about how one guy had slid down into the volcano and they barely were able to rescue him. And the other thing that was most impressive to me, Rick, was the fact that he talked about how well defended Hawaii was. There's no way, as a matter of fact, he mentions it, there's no way that anybody would dare attack us here in Hawaii. Now, back then in 1931-32, they didn't even dream about an air attack.
Right.
And it's ironic because he lived in Schofield Barracks, which was one of the focal points of the Japanese attack when they did attack in World War II. So when as a history teacher, and I know what happened later, to read how well defended he thought Hawaii was, it's filled with irony.
Well, yeah, it's interesting as you read that because, you know how it ends, and it's like, okay, here's a perception at the time and how things change in a little over, a 10, 12-year period. At the end of the book, your dad says, I hope this proves my time spent in the Army was not completely wasted. As he came back and put his...
that haunted him all the time. And one of the things, of course, that impacts that was the fact that he came out of the Army with very little money. He had a little bit saved, enough that he could start Albright, and I don't know how really he managed to go through Albright, but I guess scholarships and things like that. But he did make it through, and he got his degree, and originally intended to be a teacher. But as it turned out, when he graduated, that was just before World War II broke out for real. He ended up working in a war plant there in Reading in a place called American Chain and Cable, which was a big war producer for the military.
It's interesting, a couple minutes left in the program. He was very good, as you mentioned, at baseball, was a baseball coach, very successful, coached the Legion team, was very well known throughout that area. And when your grandfather actually played Major League Baseball.
Yes, he did. He was with the St. Louis Cardinals, and at the end of his career, he was traded to Cincinnati. And it's kind of interesting. If you look up the story, he was involved early on in the battles between when the American League and National League, finally settled down to become what they are today, the major leagues. There was an old Federal League, and he was actually on a list that he could not go to Massachusetts. The Federal League banned him because he was one of the players that had participated in playing in areas where they, like Worcester and places like that, where they ruled that they couldn't play there.
Yes.
So it was part of the baseball battles. But he came from a baseball background, and even I remember him talking to me about when he was a young man, being able to sit and listen to his my grandfather, his father, and his older brother talk baseball, and he was like a 9-year-old just in awe of them talking about baseball. And of course, Eastern Shore of Maryland is known for Home Run Baker and Jimmy Fox. And a matter of fact, my grandfather was the first to play in the modern major leagues from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and that is something that Dad was very proud of to the day he died.
It's interesting because that is sort of the legacy of the family, is this baseball connection. Starting back several generations and ending up with you as a successful high school baseball coach. The book is called Army Letters, Correspondence of Alexander Smoot, 1932 to 1935. It is an excellent read. What kind of response are you getting to the book?
Well, I've had of course it's just been out a little while, but what I've been aiming at is trying to get it into the hands of college professors who are teachers of history.
Yes.
That are looking for primary source material. And it's a nonfiction thing, but everybody, I've passed out some copies. I've got it. There's been some sales or whatever, but like I say, this is really the ground floor that we're in right now. But the response has been it's very interesting, and I had a couple people. I don't know. I hope I don't get too risque here, but one guy told me, because if you notice the book, there's not chapters in it. It's by dates. And the guy said he loves it because it's what he calls his bathroom book. He takes it to the bathroom for a day, and he said it was wonderful. He was able to read a letter a day, and it was really fascinating to him. Of course, he was a local guy, and he knew the area that Dad was talking about, and of course, Dad was always proud of his heritage here on the shore, but had to leave again because the Depression forced him to go elsewhere to find a way to make a living.
Well, the history really comes alive. We feel like as we're reading the book, we know your father, we know everybody in the family. I mean, that area comes alive as we're reading it. And we understand what people were going through during that period. The book is Army Letters, Correspondence of Alexander Smoot, 1932 to 1935. The author is his oldest son, Geoffrey Smoot. That's S-M-O-O-T. The book is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the usual places. Information at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Jeff, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program. An excellent book. Thank you so much for being with us on the show today.
Rick, I can't thank you enough for having me. I enjoyed doing this, and of course, it just rekindled some of the memories that I had from writing the book. And again, remember, you keep mentioning I wrote the book. I really transcribed the book because Dad wrote the book, and I feel really good about preserving his legacy in that respect. And I didn't have to do anything to it because it was so well written. It wasn't like editing the letters. The letters are verbatim, except for a couple times where I couldn't read the spelling and I had to kind of guess.
Yes. Well, again, I keep saying this, but it's so true. It makes history come alive. I have a much better understanding of what it was like during that period after the Depression, before we get into full-blown World War II. It's a fascinating read. Army Letters, Correspondence of Alexander Smoot, 1932 to 1935. Our guest has been Geoffrey Smoot. You're listening to This Week in America. Information on today's program at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Stay tuned. We're back right after these messages.